The sound of splintering wood echoed across the square as the royal elephant drove its weight into the fence. The structure collapsed into jagged shards under a single heavy footfall. The beast moved with a slow, rhythmic indifference, trampling the season's final harvest into the mud. Wheat stalks were crushed into the earth, and fruit trees were torn from the soil, their branches snapping like dry bone. Villagers huddled behind stone walls, watching the ruin of their livelihood. They had sent messengers to the palace for weeks, begging for intervention. Each time, the king had turned them away. He dismissed their reports as exaggerations, claiming the animal was merely roaming. The king sat in his high chamber, refusing to look out toward the fields, convinced that his property could do no wrong. In the square, the elephant let out a low, vibrating rumble that shook the dust from the rooftops. It turned toward the remaining granary, its trunk swinging with heavy, destructive force. The ground shuddered with every step the animal took. The village elders moved through the back alleys, avoiding the main path where the elephant still prowled. They reached Mullah's house, their faces etched with the exhaustion of men who had lost everything. They crowded into his small room, speaking in hushed, jagged sentences about the ruined orchards and the empty granaries. Mullah sat on a low stool, listening to the accounts. He did not interrupt, he did not offer empty comfort. When the last elder finished, the silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Mullah stood up, walked to the window, and watched the distant dust cloud rising from the square. He turned back to the men, his jaw set. "Catch the beast," he commanded. Mullah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a sharp, steady tone. "Tie it to the banyan tree by the river." The elders hesitated, looking at one another, then nodded. They left the house with a new, frantic purpose. The hemp ropes held. The massive elephant pulled against the banyan tree, but the knots remained tight. By the time the king's guards spotted the restrained animal, they were already spurring their horses back toward the palace. The news traveled fast. Within an hour, the sound of hooves thundered against the village path. The king arrived at Mullah's house, his face flushed a deep, mottled red. He did not wait for an invitation. He stormed through the doorway, his chest heaving with exertion and rage. He stopped inches from Mullah, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the river. "Mullah," the king roared, "by what authority do you bind my royal elephant?" Mullah did not flinch. He bowed low, his movements slow and perfectly grave. He stood upright, meeting the king's glare with a steady, unreadable gaze. "Your Majesty," Mullah began, "the elephant has been restless. It refuses to eat or walk unless we find it a bride. We tied it up only to prevent it from wandering off in search of a mate." The king's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He stared at Mullah, his eyes narrowing into thin, dangerous slits. The king's hand gripped the hilt of his blade, his knuckles white. The king scoffed, his laughter sharp and hollow. "You expect me to believe an elephant spoke to you of marriage?" Mullah gestured toward the village path. "The beast is waiting by the banyan tree, Your Majesty. You may ask it yourself. If I speak falsely, you may take my head." The king turned on his heel and marched toward the village, his soldiers trailing behind. As they passed through the fields, the king stopped. He looked down. The wheat was flattened, crushed into the dirt. He walked further, seeing the uprooted fruit trees and the deep, muddy craters left by the elephant's feet. The evidence of the destruction stretched for miles, a jagged scar across his land. He reached the banyan tree and saw his elephant, tethered and calm. He looked at the villagers, then back at the ruined fields. The silence was absolute. The king turned to his treasurer, his voice stripped of its earlier bluster. "Calculate the total loss of every household," he ordered. "Pay them double from the royal treasury." He then looked at Mullah, his expression shifting. "You have shown me the truth in a way my own eyes refused to see." The king stood among the ruins, the weight of his own neglect finally settling in. The next morning, the sound of carriage wheels crunched against the village path. A royal escort stopped before Mullah's door. The king had sent for him. Mullah stepped into the carriage, leaving his simple home behind. Within the palace walls, the king stood by a window overlooking the fields. He turned as Mullah entered. With a single gesture, the king appointed him as a senior advisor to the court. The task was clear: to ensure the ruler never again lost sight of the people he governed. Mulla bowed, accepting the weight of the responsibility. The village would be rebuilt, and the fields would grow again. The era of neglect had ended, replaced by a vigilance that kept the crown tethered to the truth of the people. The throne room was swallowed in a heavy, oppressive silence. The only sound was the steady rhythmic tapping of the king's signet ring against the cold marble armrest. Shadows stretched long across the floor as the king leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a predator's. He looked down at Mulla, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "Mulla," the king declared, "today I challenge your wit. You shall make a single statement. If your words are true, I will cast you into the deepest dungeon for life. But if your words are false, I will have you hanged at dawn." A collective gasp rippled through the court. The ministers shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their hands. It was a perfect trap, a web of iron and stone. If Mulla spoke the truth, he would lose his freedom forever. If he lied, he would lose his life. There seemed to be no middle ground, no escape from this royal game of death. Mulla stood alone in the center of the vast hall, his posture remarkably relaxed despite the shadow of the gallows looming over him. He did not tremble. Instead, he calmly scanned the faces of the armored guards, then turned his gaze directly toward the king. The court held its breath, the air thick with the scent of incense and fear. Mulla took a slow, deliberate breath, cleared his throat, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the tension. "Your Majesty," he said, "you are going to hang me." The words hung in the air like a blade. The king froze. His hand, which had been reaching for a golden goblet, stopped midair. The court fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Every eye was fixed on the king, waiting for the explosion of rage that surely followed such a bold and dark prediction. The king's brow furrowed as his mind began to race, desperately processing the logic of Mulla's statement. It was a masterstroke of wit. If the king proceeded with the execution, Mulla's statement would be proven true. But according to the king's own decree, a true statement required imprisonment, not death. Therefore, he could not hang him. However, if the king chose to spare Mulla from the gallows and send him to the dungeon instead, the statement "you are going to hang me" would instantly become a lie. And for a lie, the penalty was death at dawn. The king was trapped in a loop of his own making. He gripped the armrests of his throne so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at the executioner, who stood motionless in the corner, a silent shadow waiting for a command that could no longer be given. To kill him was to break the law, to imprison him was to prove the law impossible. The silence stretched for an eternity, as the king struggled with his pride and the undeniable brilliance of the man standing before him. The ministers watched, terrified, as the king's face shifted from frustration to confusion, and finally, to a begrudging, slow-growing grin. The tension in the room finally snapped as the king began to laugh, a deep, booming sound that shook the tapestries. He descended the steps of the dais and placed a hand on Mulla's shoulder. The courtiers erupted into applause, their relief palpable in the warm air. The king signaled for his treasurer, who brought forward a heavy velvet pouch overflowing with gold. Mulla accepted the reward with a slight bow, his expression as calm as when he arrived. He had turned a death sentence into a grand victory, proving that while a king holds the power of the sword, a sharp mind always holds the power of the final word.